have a range of policies and approaches in terms of how they respond to harassing speech. Under its previous regime, Twitter, now X, regularly engaged with media organizations and advocates around harassment on the platform, but obviously that's no longer the case. And there's no engagement from other platforms in which journalists and others are routinely harassed and vilified, including Truth Social. So given this, what can journalists do? And the short answer is plenty. And that's why we're so fortunate to have with us tonight the best in the business. They're Harlo Holmes, who is the Chief Information Security Officer and Director of Digital Security at Freedom of the Press Foundation. And by the way, FPF right here is co-sponsoring this evening's panel, and they'll be hosting a reception afterwards with cookies. So stick around. Harlo, really thanks for that, and thanks to Executive Director Trevor Tim, FPF Director, who's also here. Where's Trevor? Hi, Trevor. Thanks to you and the team for being with us tonight. We're also joined by Viktorya Vilk. She's the Director of Digital Safety and Free Expression at PEN America. I would say FPF and PEN, with some others who we'll also talk about, are really the leaders in the space, the go-to resource for newsrooms and individual journalists facing harassment and threats online. Last but not least, we're joined by Sara Rafsky. She's an information security analyst at the New York Times and also a proud alumna of the Committee to Protect Journalists, the organization I used to lead. Sara can give us a sense of how a leading news organization with considerable resources thinks about the issue and how they manage it and the kinds of strategies they've found to be effective. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, in addition to FPF, the Center for Community Media here at the Newmark School. I'd like to welcome my colleague, Darlie Gervais. Darlie, welcome. Thank you for joining us. She's not only representing CCM this evening, but she herself is a veteran of the Haitian Times, one of the co-founders, I think, back in the day, along with Gary Pierre, who's also here. Gary, if you could say hello, welcome. We're so glad to have you. We're grateful to the Kettering Foundation for helping to support tonight's conversation. Based in Dayton, Ohio, the Kettering Foundation works to inspire and connect individuals and organizations to advance thriving and inclusive communities around the globe. Finally, and especially given that we're gathered here at the Newmark School, I should note that Craig Newmark himself has been a leading donor and supporter in efforts to combat online harassment, and we're grateful to him for that generous support. And did I say finally? Actually, I have one last thing, which is that tonight's event is being recorded, but not live streamed, just for your information. We'll make it available to students and others who are interested in tonight's discussion. We'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take your questions, so please have them ready. And now I would like to invite our panelists to the stage while I get this screen out of the way and this bright projector, but you can take a seat, whatever order you like, but we'll start with McElvey, so and I'm gonna bring the screen up. Turn this off.
Where you gonna sit?
Wherever you can sit, why don't you sit in the second chair, and I will. Okay, and then if we could turn off the projector.
Projector off on the panel.
Right here. You're gonna have to help me. Stop. Oh, it's right here. Okay. Thank you for the tech support. Okay. Thank you all again. So we have 5 panelists and 4 microphones. I think this is a manageable problem. So somebody will have to share, but we'll make it work. Okay, so I'm going to start with something incredibly basic, but we obviously have some veterans of the Haitian Times, but there are probably some people in our audience who are not familiar at all with the Haitian Times. And that's unfortunate, but could you enlighten them? Tell us a little bit about the Haitian Times. What do you do? And if you could, Harlo, if you could pass a microphone to McElvey, and tell us a little bit about what you cover and who your audience is and your approach to the news.
Sure. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Really appreciate you making time to join us to hear about our experiences on this panel. The Haitian Times started 25 years ago. We're actually celebrating our 25th year anniversary in 2 weeks on the
Wow,
24th.
congratulations.
Yeah, so
Yay.
Gary, as you all probably know by now, worked at the New York Times and realized that this community of growing Haitians, Haitian Americans, we weren't being covered as we should have because our stories weren't going as told as much. And so he took this gamble and decided to form this news organization. He roped in Darlie, out of Haiti. And so they and a few others co-founded this to bridge the gap. That's the slogan of the Haitian Times. The idea was that because he grew up here as American, people like me at the time, I was at Baruch College at the time, any alums, we were more comfortable consuming news in English, American-style journalism, than we were consuming news in French, right? Or in just black and white, really grayish newspapers with that ink that stuck to you.
Yes.
Yeah, and the radio in Haitian Creole wasn't really for us as much. It was like our older parents' generation. So he said, okay, this community needs news in a way that they'll be interested in it and consume it. And so he founded the Haitian Times. I came along as an intern studying journalism at Baruch, and I was supposed to stay for a semester to get my credit and be out. I got lured into it because our story, I think, as Haitians, as people, as just Haiti, the country, period, was just so incredibly marvelous. I got lured into staying for about 3 years. The media landscape, too, was interesting at the time. This is like 2000, right after 9/11 is when I joined. And so I had the opportunity, just as a cub, literally, to travel all over the world. Not literally a cub, but I got to literally travel. Yeah, all over the country to just meet Haitians, not just Haitians, but people in government who were trying to reach Haitians. Went to the Caribbean, Europe, in the service of telling our stories.
Amazing, amazing.
And so, yeah, I left. I was gone for a long time. I tried the daily news experience and then came back about 4 years ago around COVID for the same reason that Gary had started the organization. I noticed that we weren't talking enough about Haitians dying of COVID because people were still thinking that it's a hoax at the time. They were like, is this real? We're still making jokes about it, like the beer, But like my mom was losing her friends. So I reached back out again. I was just like, oh, I think I have some story ideas. And that's how I walked myself into becoming an editor. It's the fastest promotion cycle ever. I went from like a sometimes writer to a regular editor to managing editor to executive editor. And funny thing is, 2-3 years ago, when the assassination happened in Haiti, our president in Haiti was assassinated. We had this influx of people from Latin America, Haitians, being forced out because of racism and the economy in Chile and Brazil. They ended up in Del Rio in encampments. And we said, we need to follow that story and continue to tell people how these newcomers are living. We also saw during COVID that a lot of people were dialing into our community conversations from all over the country. So we pitched to Ford a special project that looks at how and where Haitians were faring in heartland places like Indianapolis, like Springfield, Ohio.
Well, that's a great segue because I want to now go into, tell us a little bit, before we go into your experience with, this systematic harassment, tell us a little bit about how you were approaching the elections. How were you covering the elections for the Haitian community? What were the stories? I know you were doing a whole series of events across the country to reach Haitian immigrant communities. So tell us a little bit about your approach.
Yeah, so over the past 2-3 years or so, we've been on this journey of community listening, right? Audience listening to figure out, how do we marry what the community wants and what we want them, what they need to hear, right? So Gary and our audience manager, Sherelle, they've been on this journey of doing focus groups, both digital and physical across the country. So we've been taking that data and just looking at, what people say they want and what they need. And one thing was like more engagement, like being out there, being in the field, giving them an opportunity to talk to you, we talk to them. And so going beyond just taking the news, doing the report, and then that's it.
Creating a dialogue.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
So we had that in mind, right? We also went through a lot of local journalism type workshops to look at how reporting on local communities can tell the story of what it is we go into at the macro level. So with that spirit, we decided, okay, let's try to do more in-person conversations, not just the virtual conversations we had during COVID. And so that's what led me to think about organizing a town hall in Springfield, Ohio, as we saw the hate, starting to leak out online and through conversations with people there.
So there was a kind of ambient level of hostility, distrust that manifested itself online, but that, of course, spiked after the presidential debate in September, where Trump made this, just crazy claim. I'm reluctant to even repeat it, but I think the pets and all that nonsense, and then that was amplified, and then that kind of encouraged his supporters to really kind of pile on, and you and the Haitian Times were the target. Can you tell us a little bit about what that, I know it was absolutely awful, and I hate to ask you to kind of relive it, but I wonder if you could share with us what the experience was like for you and for your colleagues.
Sure. I'm still going through the experience. It's not over yet, It's, and I think that's what's surprising about it. Like when you do a story, someone might send you an email or they put in the comments, they're not happy about it, they hate you, they tell you to go back to your country, all this stuff. You brush it off and you keep doing your job, right? So this one, though, started even before we got to Springfield. It started when we reported that there was a white supremacist who had held a march, an anti-Haitian migrants march, in that city, and we wrote about it. And we wrote about it using the name of that this person gave to the city commissioners when he went there to warn them about more things coming to the city if they didn't stop letting these migrants come into the city. So that's when we started seeing a lot of just nasty comments and getting emails from these people. And then J.D. Vance elevated it, and it just kind of snowballed from there. Donald Trump repeated it, and our stories about the impact on the community, because we wanted to focus on how people were being really intimidated, really scared. They were facing physical intimidation and just a lot of scare tactics online and physically. Kids being bullied, that sort of thing. Folks being afraid to go to the store. So I thought, okay, we'll go and we'll invite the NAACP to talk about what it is new immigrants need to know about life in America when it comes to racism. Because a lot of them didn't necessarily realize that these were racist attacks, because they hadn't felt that level before. So we went, we took precautions when we saw the digital harassment. We tried not to get Zoom bumped, for example. We had to cancel the in-person to make it virtual. So changed my hotel from Springfield to Columbus. It's like, no, we have to go, because if we don't go, they silence us. We can't let them win. That was a conversation we had internally. So I went, but a lot of just weird little things were happening throughout that week with the messages. And I remember Sunday night getting off the plane at JFK or LaGuardia, whichever, and seeing on my phone that I was getting a message on my personal, business email. It was like, oh, I'm on radar. It's not just the Haitian Times email anymore, right? So I ought to go and make sure I'm not hacked. So I go in and do two-factor authentication, all the good stuff, take down my email. Yeah. But it wasn't enough, because the next morning, after, dropped off my kids from school, getting ready for the day, or we have all these stories to post now. This was a crazy weekend. I hear the doorbell. I think it's a delivery. I don't go. I hear the doorbell again. I'm like, oh, he really wants a signature. So I go down, and I saw a police cruiser through my window right at the same time that I saw one police officer leaving the porch to go to the side, and I hear voices on the other side of the house. It's like, what is going on? But I just like knew at that point that I was like, please don't let this be because of Springfield. But it was. By the time I like went to open my front door, I heard voices on my back porch. There were like three cops already on the back porch looking in to see if anyone was home. And so I like, can I help you, officer? It's like, yeah, we're here. There's we have a domestic call. We need to come in and make sure everyone's okay. Like, who are you? And it's like, I'm the person who lives here. I'm the homeowner. What are you here for? And it turns into this like dialogue where he's like, he doesn't want to tell me what he's here for. But I'm like, I'm not gonna let you in my house unless you tell me what you're here for. Let me call my husband to tell him the police are here in case anything happens, right? So I do that, and I'm like, can I call my husband? Because I don't want to get shot. Like, is it okay if I just like, because you learn as a Black person to let the police know what you're doing so you don't spook them and things get out of hand, right? Like, I need to call my husband, like, before I let you in, is that okay? So that happens, and then I'm like, well, what did you get? Like, what's the call? And he goes, well, I need to know who lives here besides you. Is there a male in the house? Yes, my husband, what's his name? I tell his name, and then he checks his phone and is like, oh, that doesn't match. I'm like, what doesn't match? He's like, I can't tell you. He said, officer, I think I've been doxxed. And he goes, what is that? It's like, doxxed. I think I've been doxxed because of what I do. It's like, what do you do? I'm a journalist. I've been doing stories about Haitians and the pets going viral. It's like, oh. So then his like surgeon or somebody comes like, she thinks she's been doxxed. And so the surgeon goes, what's that? It's like, oh my God. Long story short, this is a really long story. I'm gonna wrap it up. They leave, they check that, they had to come in the house. I called Gary obviously because he had been in Springfield online as well. And I'm like, well, who else? This could be happening to other people, let me check. I tell him what's going on, hang up. It was a series of phone calls, but they're like, okay, we'll close it out, we'll check the house. It was like 6 or 7 of them who went in and checked all over the house. I'm, afraid the whole time, because it's police in your house.
Yeah,
like,
terrifying.
who wants that? So I'm like, okay, I'd like to make a report. He's like, report what? I said, the fact that you're sitting in my kitchen. You shouldn't, the fact that I've been doxxed and like swatted.
And
so,
swatted just is when you make these false reports, right?
Right.
And it comes from the term like a SWAT team, and sometimes the police really come in an aggressive manner, and it can really put people in tremendous risk. So that's what happened.
Yeah, but I think this experience just illuminated for me how ready we're not as a media industry, as law enforcement, police, and the prosecutors. We're just not ready to deal with this in a serious way. Like, they're tagging this as aggravated harassment right now. I feel like it's more of an assault, Right. What if I had a heart condition and like died from the stress, That sort of thing. If I had an older person in the house with me, pets or whatever, anything could have happened. And I think for just our media ecosystem, we have to stop taking these wild claims and elevating them and amplifying them, especially when we know they're lies. Like, who does it serve at that point?
Yeah. Well, let's come back to that question, but I want to bring in our experts now that you kind of described your experience, which is absolutely terrifying and awful. And I want to start with Harlo and ask you, is this a extreme version of the kind of harassment that you observed in your work, or is this something that you have seen before? Why does this sort of thing happen? Yes, yeah.
Thank you. Fantastic. Hi, thanks. And thank you so much for, we all know that particular story, but also hearing you tell it refreshed actually helps a lot and teaches so much. And as Joel introduced us as experts, I absolutely don't really believe that that's 100% something that we can claim. And it's not only because of the expertise you have as a media maker and one so esteemed as you are, but it also definitely points to something that I think is really important, which is that from a digital security training perspective, we have put in a lot of research into these various mechanisms and tactics, and we all have hypothetical playbooks for how people should ideally respond when something attempts to jump out of the screen to the point where it becomes physical. But quite frankly, that is not an exact cybersecurity science, and it's something measurable in criminality and the interplay between what we can contribute as cybersecurity experts and the response that is needed in order to meet our needs from law enforcement and also platforms, for instance, which we can talk about a little bit later on, especially with the assistance of Viktorya and Sara. All of that needs to come together in order for us to eradicate this problem. One thing, though, that I do think is important to underline is that with the combination of research and with the experiences of so many of our peers in this field that we are learning from in some ways that are painful and traumatic, one of the things that we are coming to is a taxonomy. And actually, I'd love to give great kudos to groups like PEN America and others within our coalition against online violence who have done a lot of work in, among other things, contributing to an actual taxonomy of the various tactics of online harassment, online abuse, and the violence that stems from it. And it's important to have taxonomies about the minutia of these tactics. What separates doxing from swatting? What separates online hate speech, right, from things that grow in scale, leveraging either ideology or leveraging the virality of a platform's algorithm? Having ways to define these and also being to compartmentalize that and share them outwards so it sits within, at least within every media organization so they can refer to that, actually does go a long way. Yeah.
And what kinds of, just on a tactical level, what kinds of guidance do you give to media organizations that are confronting, particularly ones, we're going to hear from Sara, who works at the New York Times, which is obviously an organization with a lot more resources than most news organizations, but for a news organization that doesn't have a Sara Rafsky, what are the basic strategies that you recommend?
Sure. So this definitely, or the answer to this question definitely points to scale. Mm-hmm. At Freedom of the Press Foundation, our team is very small, as I'm sure a lot of you know if you're familiar with us, but we are one of a number of organizations that work very hard in serving as many news organizations and media makers as we can on a variety of scale. And the vast majority of them do tend to be very small organizations with, very limited budgets because the money that they have, they are definitely pouring towards making the news for us. And so it's actually really important that we emphasize things that are that fall under the banner of, as I like to quote my colleague Davis, who you've met, prepared, not scared. So we definitely go in with the idea that there are certain fundamentals to digital security that are especially adept at protecting people from online harassment, such as you mentioned, two-factor authentication and credential security, meaning use your password manager. I'm sure you probably have heard this very, very recently and more frequently over the past couple years. But quite frankly, when we started out in this particular game, no one was really talking about it. So we're all really proud to see that being something that people just kind of take for granted. But one of the things, and I think this is really interesting within your story as you tell it, is there were certain things that felt off that raised your internal alarm. And the moment when you noticed that this was going beyond, your enterprise account, right? And it was actually seeping into parts of your personal life as it's reflected in the accounts that you have access to on your phone. One of the things that we do talk to people in preparing themselves for any such eventuality is the fact that what you're learning in a corporate environment and the boring people in IT or whatever say you have to turn on this password manager, you have to install this two-factor app. This actually extends to your personal life because not only in cases where things become unfortunately physical, also in other types of online harassment and violence against people that is based off of that, such as impersonation attacks, account takeovers, and all of the reputational damage that can be done by commandeering somebody's Facebook account, for instance, or something like identity theft, right? All of these things, all of these weaponizations of digital tools often stem from that basis of not necessarily realizing that the same two-factor that keeps you safe at work is also what's going to keep you and your family safe at home. So that's just one example, and that's part of the basics that we like to package up and give to people in their trainings when they're just learning the basics of digital security.
Well, Freedom of the Press Foundation has amazing resources, so does PEN America, so does the International Women's Media Foundation, so does the Committee to Protect Journalists. That's the one thing that I'll note. There's a lot of resources available from those organizations and others. But Viktorya, I want to bring you in to talk about, because part of your role is visiting news organizations, and of course PEN is an organization that's committed to freedom of expression. So what impact do these tactics have on, we heard about McElvee's experience and her impulse and the Haitian Times impulse to let people determine what they can and can't say, but this is a lot to withstand. Does this tactic work? What impact does it have on the freedom of expression climate and the news and news organizations that you've interacted with?
Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you, McElvee, for talking about your experiences in front of everyone. Can't be easy. I'm going to answer your question, but I'm also going to slightly answer your previous question. You asked how rare is it, right? Or how common is it? So swatting is still mercifully fairly rare, right, when an actual police force or SWAT team gets sent to your house. But I should point out that a man was shot to death that way only a few years ago in a swatting situation, so it's extraordinarily dangerous. It's not as rare as it should be, but it is rare. But almost everything else that you're talking about is extraordinarily common, right? Doxing, when somebody publishes your home address or your cell phone or where your children go to school, is happening constantly to reporters all the time and other folks. Hateful speech, sexual harassment, gender disinformation, I mean, a whole slew of tactics and a lot of really coordinated stuff. And just to underscore the point, there was a really good study that came out from UNESCO and the International Center for Journalists, which surveyed thousands upon thousands of women reporters all over the world, and they found that 73% of women reporters had experienced online abuse, which is a lot. 1 in 5 said that the online abuse migrated offline. So it may not be swatting, but it's all kinds of other stuff. So 1 in 5 is a lot, right? And an extraordinarily alarming statistic. That same study found that over 30% of the reporters had engaged in all kinds of self-censorship. They changed how they wrote, what they wrote about. They made themselves significantly less visible online. And even when they didn't do those things, they were constantly thinking about like, should I say this? Shouldn't I say this? How should I say this? What will happen if I say it? And so in terms of impacts, there are myriad. I mean, there's extraordinary psychological impact, right, on people's, people have severe anxiety, depression, stress, sleeplessness, all kinds of other physiological impacts that are sort of psychological and physiological impacts from online abuse. There's a lot of self-censorship, and depending on the institution, and of course, I was not at all surprised to see that the Haitian Times had your back, but that's not always the case. What you will sometimes see is these weaponized campaigns that then newsrooms basically, wash their hands of the reporter and leave the reporter hanging high and dry. And that just amplifies the harm and the damage. But from the standpoint of like what are systemic impacts, that's an example, right? If the point is to undermine press freedom, undermine the credibility of individual journalists, and a newsroom doesn't have a journalist back, then it's worked.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is really, an intolerable situation in many ways, and the power that these individuals have to use these organized campaigns to get inside people's head and, terrorize them. But the opportunity to engage with the platforms, as I kind of laid out in my introduction, it's limited. The opportunity to engage through some sort of regulatory approach, we haven't had much success. So on the continuum of, we have to make this stop, do we have to figure out like how to live with this and respond in a kind of tactical way? Where are you?
I knew you'd ask me that question.
I warned you, so
you did.
You're prepared.
So I'm prepared. I mean, okay, I'm going to give you an actual honest answer, but I will point out that attacks against the press are as old as the press, right? I mean, people have used all kinds of tactics and strategies to intimidate, physically attack, jail, hold without trial, et cetera, reporters for a very long time. And I have a good friend who's a technologist who used to work with me at Penn, who always talks about how the internet is an amplification machine. So that in a way, like all the things that and frankly, sexism, racism, all the kinds of underlying isms that dominate a lot of the identity-based attacks that we see against reporters are also as old as time. But the issue is that the internet, right, and particularly social media platforms, the kind of speed, the virality, the reach, and the kind of global reach, like we haven't talked at all about in transnational repression, I won't open that door here, but the ways in which you can flee a country and the government can still get at you, that is the thing that's changed, right? Like that's what's different from the other kinds of tactics and strategies that we've all seen for centuries. So do I think we can make online harassment stop? No more than I think that we can make the murder of or jailing of journalists stop, or racism or sexism stop. Should that be our goal? Absolutely. But I actually don't think it's an either or. Like with any kind of extremely systemic problem like this one, you have to tackle it from all sides, right? You have to tackle it on the one hand from the standpoint of self-defense and resilience. You have to make sure that people have the tools, but also the individualized support, right? Not just training, but actual like hand-holding, individualized support in a crisis to get through that crisis so they can keep doing their jobs. But self-defense is never going to be a solution to a systemic problem, right? It's like when you tell women, like, if you just learn martial arts, then you won't get attacked. It's like, well, maybe we shouldn't be attacking women. And so I feel like the flip side of that is we have to keep working with the platforms, and we have to keep advocating, and we probably have to also be advocating for some regulatory sort of solutions with the platforms, because as much as they are awful and getting harder and harder to work with, that is still where most of this is playing out. And so, we've worked with platforms for 6 years, and we will continue to do that. I actually think that there are regulatory possibilities too, and in fact, there's been stuff coming out of Europe that many of us have issues with from a free expression standpoint, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying and looking for solutions. So, and I think something that isn't happening almost at all, but is a very free speech friendly thing that we could be doing is educating law enforcement.
Right.
Like that's not a new regulation where we use, the power of the state to jail the very people we're trying to protect by accident, right? Like if we try to ban some kind of harassment or something like that. But I'm going to give a quick anecdote and then I'll stop talking. Some years ago, I was asked to speak to hundreds and hundreds of police officers and law enforcement professionals. from all over the country. And I was very nervous. I don't get nervous public speaking, but I was worried that they were going to basically act like online harassment isn't a real problem. This is like so low on their, list of things that they worry about as police officers, and that I was going to have to basically be sitting there convincing them that this matters for journalists and for activists and for other folks. And here's what happened. They started raising their hands and saying, Viktorya, I'm really worried about doxing. My family has experienced doxing. I was very concerned about the safety of my spouse and my children. Do you think you could teach me some of that hacking doxing stuff that you teach people? And I was like, what? And then everyone else started raising their hand and saying they want that too. And then they were basically saying that they have no support from their own institution when they get doxed, and that they have no training to reduce their online footprint. So that's where we are. Right? So it's not that surprising that they didn't know how to help you because they're worried about it themselves, but they internally don't get the kind of support. So that just blew my mind.
Yeah, that is surprising until you think about it, and then it's not surprising, yeah. Sara, tell us a little bit about, just simple question, what is your job? What do you do at the New York Times? Maybe it's not so simple.
Good question. I think my family who's here wants to know the answer to that too. I work on the digital security team. I work specifically in a newsroom-facing role, so I provide digital security support and guidance, predominantly for the newsroom, sometimes for the business side of the company as well. That takes many forms. It takes an educational role. We provide training and guidance. It takes a crisis response role. When people find themselves in these situations, we help them, and we do a lot of thinking around broader issues like how can you report safely on China or the elections, et cetera, from a digital security perspective. I will just say, to the broader context of this panel, when I joined the Times, I worked on a different team whose portfolio included physical safety, threat response work, psychological support, among other things. And on both teams and in both roles, online harassment has really been at the center of what I did and what these teams do. And I think that reflects, one, just how pervasive a threat is. It is, as everyone has described. Also, thankfully, and I'm not just trying to be a company woman, this is true, the company takes it really seriously, thankfully. I think, from an institutional perspective, the days in which you were told just to have a thicker skin and this was part of the job are long gone, at least from an institutional perspective. There may still be individuals who feel that way, but the company certainly takes it very seriously. And then also, I think the ways, now I've gone really off tangent from what I do, but okay. I think, the forms in which online harassment occurs and the repercussions it has are so cross-spectrum, multidisciplinary. It has obviously digital security elements. As we've heard, it less frequently but can have physical security elements. It very frequently, we haven't talked about that as much, but has severe reputational consequences. Right. Occasionally, less frequently, there could be legal issues. And so it's very important in my role and with my colleagues that we approach this issue with people from across the country who have across the company who have expertise in all of those areas, basically, because that's how we're thinking about online harassment.
And how do you, I think Viktorya and Harlo and McElvey in her own presentation was talking about the fear that this is intended to create that makes people, it's painful. You kind of have almost a human impulse that you don't want to have to go through this. How do you reduce the likelihood that will happen? Are there tactics and strategies that you think that you found to be effective?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, and we rely on the Viktoryas and the Harlos of the world to try to make the world a better place. Unfortunately, in the world in which we're operating, I think a lot of security work, you think about how to prevent bad outcomes, right? At least in what we do, there is no preventing this. This is a risk that we have just sort of accepted we cannot prevent. It is going to happen. So then it really just becomes about mitigating harm. And you can mitigate harm from preventative measures. You can do it from reactive measures. I think the sad reality, at least from where I'm sitting, is that the reactive measures you can take are sort of far less impactful at this point. You can report something to a social media platform, but as has been widely reported, the trust and safety and content moderation departments of these companies have been widely diminished. It's most famously at X, formerly Twitter, but this is across the spectrum at Meta and other platforms as well. And then there are all sorts of new platforms like Truth Social or what have you, where this isn't part of the model at all. So That's not really such a great option anymore. If you are doxxed and you're concerned about being swatted, you can call your local police precinct and try to warn them. Maybe they'll know what swatting is, maybe they won't, so good luck, see how that happens. There are a lot of things you can take, I think, from more of the psychological support perspective in terms of making sure the reporter knows the institution has their back, and that's obviously, as Viktorya was saying, very important. But these aren't great, from a mitigation perspective, like these aren't great steps, so we focus a lot on the preventative part.
Right.
And again, we're not preventing online harassment, we're just trying to mitigate harm. And by mitigating harm, what I mean is that the way trolls work, right, is that they find personal information about you online and then they weaponize it against you. And this could be through a shaming mechanism, it could be finding embarrassing photos from your college days or things you said 20 years ago that embarrass you and using those to shame you or damage your reputation. Or it could just be finding information about you and your family that in any other context would be totally innocuous, but when in the hands of like trolls spreading it across the information is terrifying. And I'll just say, even the toughest reporters who just like don't blink an eye at the most heinous death threats, when they see that their kids' photos are being sent around or there's something about where their kid goes to school, even the most battle-hardened reporter gets freaked out because, who wouldn't?
So yeah, let me just ask you one last thing before we go back to McElvey and the experience of the Haitian Times, which is just about identity. I mean, Victoria in particular, and it's obvious from this conversation, but Victoria made the point, that these are, identity is weaponized in many instances against women based on race, based on immigration status, based on a variety of factors. How do you, in supporting New York Times journalists, factor in their identities, and what kinds of support can you provide based on concerns of this nature?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been interesting is understanding how many different levels of identity there are. So, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone at this point that I get to read all the hate mail, right? And as I'm sure a lot of you do as well, and it falls along all the kind of lines you would assume, gender lines, race lines, religion lines, sexual orientation, et cetera. So obviously, people who fall into these groups are at greater risk of sort of targeted online harassment based on their identity, and so working with them to recognize that and thinking about how to limit their exposure, but also how it might affect the beat that they're working on. I think obviously if you're covering white supremacists, your identity and your profile may play a role, but there's all sorts of kind of unexpected ways as well. And then the last thing I'll just say is what I think has been interesting is also the ways just being affiliated with the New York Times as part of their identity. Right. That obviously gives great benefit in terms of the resources they can access and that they have teams like us to protect them. But it just also elevates their risk in a way I think that maybe some of them don't appreciate, because if you're on the Trump beat or on politics, like you might appreciate that there's sort of a spotlight being shined on you. But even if you're covering education or public health, or God forbid, like you wrote a negative review of a Taylor Swift album. Because you work for the New York Times, people are gonna read it, and people are going to go after you in maybe greater numbers than if you worked somewhere else.
So McElvey, I wanna come back to you now. You've heard from, I know that Harlo downplayed their status as experts, but I'm going to affirm it because I view you as really having tremendous experience. So, but first tell us a little bit about what you did, because we kind of stopped the story with you've been swatted, you're facing this doxing, you're facing streams of harassment. What was the response? What kinds of strategies were you able to employ internally, and what difference did they make? Let's if you could pass the microphone to thank you. Yeah, okay, thanks.
No, I mean, we were really heartened to see the response from just the media ecosystem, like writ large, right? We had people from PEN America, IWMF, just API, American Press Institute, NABJ, like anyone you could think of has a voice or a platform, reached out to us to ask how they could support what they could do. One of the first things we did was I had existing relationships with PEN America. They had done a training for us over the summer on disinformation, misinformation in the elections. So with IWMF, we'd attended their trainings, So we knew the people, they knew us. And so because of those existing relationships, it was easy to kind of say, okay, there's trust. I trust you. Yes. If you feel like I need delete me accounts, subscriptions, just please.
What is that? Maybe you want to explain what delete me
Yeah.
is, or at these other, or someone else want to jump in and just explain what these.
So the delete me is this subscription service that goes through all of your instances where personal information about you shows up on the internet, or it's just on different digital platforms, and they go through it, and
So like public databases.
public and private and third-party
I see.
databases, right? So in my instance, I think they came up with nearly 3,000 instances where my personal information had existed somewhere, right? The majority, like 90%, was through third-party
I see.
brokers. So if it's like my phone company or something, if I download an app and the app asked me if, like for my birthday or something, they were keeping that data somewhere, you know, to verify my age or whatever. They were keeping that data somewhere and potentially selling it to other folks, because that's what data brokers do, right? So the delete me helps you figure out like where you're showing up, right? And it lets you go through the process of, I shouldn't be here, go through and ask them to remove me from all of these instances, right? And so that takes a lot of time. It costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
And someone has to do that to make sure once your information is removed, it doesn't reappear. So there's this like monitoring that goes on for months at a time, just to try to mitigate, like Sara was saying, Victoria, just to try to mitigate like the possibility of you getting doxxed and your personal information being out there. So we started off with those. I was already in the process of setting up the delete me piece. And so they like upgraded me to like a premium account, whatever that, you know, free of charge, to make sure that our information wouldn't show up in places like, you know, porn sites. They did, you know. We started getting notifications that, you know, thank you for subscribing to whatever porn site. And it was like, don't click like one of these things. We went ahead and had Gary added, our editor-in-chief, Vanya was added. Anyone who had a public-facing role in the company was given delete me accounts, just to help monitor and mitigate anyone else on our team being doxxed or swatted. So that was like the first thing we did. Oh, no, actually, my husband went and got more cameras from Lowe's to put all around the house.
Okay, that's not a bad idea.
Yeah, just in case, because we just didn't know. And we were thinking about, well, what if someone actually comes to the house, right?
Yeah.
So those were the first two things, like cameras for physical security, perimeter. I had to call my kids' schools to tell them, hey, this was advice from the physical security consultant. Call your kids' schools and tell them this happened, in case someone calls the school to try to say something involving them. So that freaked me out, obviously. Yeah. So it was going through all of these things, going through Facebook and Instagram, all of it, to try to take down anything. I took down our cute family photo. That was my cover photo, but you know, that's what you have to do in the immediate aftermath. There's a lot more.
Yeah. Well, I want to also talk, the last thing I want to do before we open it up to questions is just ask you a little bit about like the emotional toll this took, and also ask our panelists if they can talk a little bit about some of the support and resources that are available to support people emotionally when they're going through this. There's a whole new report on peer networks that maybe one of you wants to comment on, and maybe Sara, if you want to weigh in on kinds of resilience support that the Times offers. So I'd like to hear a little bit, just very briefly, if you could just tell us a little bit about, I mean, it must have, I can imagine your family, that didn't sign up for this, and they are all of a sudden dragged into this, and you feel vulnerable in your own home. I mean, that's huge.
The main thing was, do I talk about this or not talk about it, right? And so then I'm getting advice saying the way bullies work is if you talk about it, the more likely they are to go away. Like, not talking about it is actually kind of like giving them license to continue harassing you. And, talking with my family about it, extremely supportive family, So my mom, my brother, sister, like, like, go for it. My husband's like, yeah, F them. Like, they already did this. What more can they do? So I had that support, thankfully, before I decided to go on media to talk about this. Obviously, our team at the Haitian Times was like no holds barred. So I've been in sort of like fight back mode for the past month. I haven't like processed anything.
Okay.
I haven't. I get too angry just thinking about like what happened like that Monday morning. I can't get past like that first stage
Understood.
at all.
Does anyone else want to comment on what this experience can feel like emotionally and what kinds of support are available to address that? Yeah.
I can start and other people can keep going. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of support that both individuals and institutions, both from the standpoint of media organizations, but also the nonprofits that work with media organizations can do. I mean, I think we offer self-defense training and kind of resources, not in a martial arts sense, although I like to pretend, but I don't know any martial arts. But in terms of your online visibility of your online footprint, helping you figure out what it is and how to reduce it. We do that at Penn. The IWMF does that. FPF does that. So does CPJ. So there's a whole bunch of organizations that will do that for you. We do individual kind of consultations, not formally or officially, but it happens all the time, so we do them, where we will sit down one-on-one with someone and talk them through a crisis. And we find that people really, really value that because they sort of don't want to read a guide in that moment. They want to talk to a human being. Right. There is a lot that an institution can do to support you. I think most importantly, to just publicly and privately have your back. The institution that you work for or that you're freelancing for or whatever. In our case, we asked if you folks wanted any public statements, and you said you did. So we did some public statements, and I know other NGOs did, which I think it's not like any individual statement's going to do that much, but to see that there's a wall of organizations standing up behind an outlet, I think is important, and also organizations that are calling it out for a press freedom violation and not just, haha, trolls. And then I think we just published a report on called The Power of Peer Support, which we did with a scholar at Columbia University, where we found that the thing that seems to really get people through this stuff the most is not all the technical support, although that helps, and Delete Me and all the rest, but actually support from peers, right? Being able to talk to other journalists, other writers, other folks in your field, other editors who've been through what you've been through, who understand the kind of complexities of the profession. Because many of the folks we talk to, I mean, it's really, really helpful to go to a professional, psychologist and talk to a therapist. I strongly encourage that. It's very, very good. But they've had many folks come to me and say, yeah, but my therapist told me to stop being a journalist because it seems like a really stressful profession. And I'm like, well, that's not very helpful, right? And I think when you talk to a bunch of other reporters who've been through what you've been through, they're not going to tell you that. They're going to have a completely different conversation with you. But we don't actually have structured networks where reporters can talk to one another about that kind of stuff that are confidential, that are secure, and I think that's a major place where we can kind of improve. But those are some things off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's others.
Harlo, Sara, you want to?
Sure.
Yeah, please.
Sure. So I would start by saying that so much of current responses to online harassment has been the product of hacking. And let me rephrase that. I would say that we in this space who have been, among the first to kind of formalize and organize responses to online harassment in ad hoc ways, hacking the systems of those platforms has gone a long way. So for instance, you would not have not only things like, the ability to mute, block, and report. You wouldn't have algorithmic responses to, bad words in your DMs that you can not only mute manually, but perhaps even let an algorithm take over for you. None of these things would exist were it not for the relationships and the research that we as members of this space have shared with these platforms. So this is what I mean by hacking, or perhaps we're hacking back, and to the point where that has been absorbed into what we now expect from these platforms. So much so that actually the ability to block someone and mute someone or whatever, these are more and more becoming boxes that these platforms have to tick in order to remain operational in the markets where they have so many users, as per the DSA and other regulation that has been springing up across the globe. So this is actually a real positive way to look at the gains that we've made over the past decade, let's say, not only as people on the front lines of experience of online harassment, but people who also have, like, you know, the depth of perception to call it out for what it is. And now we have to think about what the next hacks are in order to move even further, in order to make sure that the events that McElvey has shared with us and has happened to so many others do not happen increasingly. And that actually doesn't require asking a couple of questions, such as, you know, you had thought about immediately how to protect your family, how to speak to law enforcement, how to reach out to schools, your school, in order to warn them of what might be going on, thinking about your family and other things like that. What does a script look like that, you know, will give you the pertinent information that you need to communicate and where to communicate that to? That is actually something that the research enthusiasts amongst us can actually help people from their experience put together as part of a toolkit. Penn and Susan McGregor and like other folks have done amazing research about the power of allyship. But now what's missing is actually telling that story to newsrooms of a variety of sizes, what that looks like at scale, so they can actually put their money where their mouth is and start offering that support to people who need it. And that's just another thing. And including things like, you know, how we'd all like to, once again, have this hypothetical response of how a newsroom expresses support for its colleagues, especially in the public sphere, especially in cases like Sarah mentioned about where online harassment is more draws upon like tactics of retaliation. What does that response look like? What does, in your HR manual, what does it say that you can expect from your employer in the event that that happens to you? And so these are the questions that need to be answered more regularly, and we need to find strategies that work until we get to the next horizon where these things are just expected and part of the way things operate.
Well, that's a lot there, Harlo. Thank you so much for that. And Sarah, let me give you the opportunity to jump in, especially on the peer support, allyship, and what you've seen in your own newsroom about how that plays out. And then please have your questions ready, because we're going to go to questions.
Yeah. In my previous role at the Times, with another CPJ alumni, I helped Maria Salazar-Ferro set up a really like first in class, if I say so myself, psychological support initiative. And I won't go into great detail about it, but essentially it relies on the expertise of the DART Center at Columbia Journalism School, which, if you don't know the DART Center, they have been sort of at the vanguard for years at exploring the sort of psychological and mental health implications of working in journalism, both for journalists but also for interview subjects and things like that. And they train clinicians specifically in journalism so they can speak, you know, with more knowledge to journalists who are experiencing this. So there's that, which is obviously incredible and we're very proud of, but understand it's not a resource that every newsroom can provide. I will just, to go back to sort of the tactical level, you know, as I said before, the reactive steps aren't great. There are things you can do that we try to do, like tell people to step away from their social media accounts, and we'll monitor things for them so that we can determine if there's been an escalation or a direct threat and they don't have to watch themselves. There are things like that. But I will just go back to the education part and the preventative mitigation steps. You know, the main thing we do as our preventative steps is we sort of help people do a very extensive online audit of themselves to really grapple with what information is available about them out there, and we sort of separate into what you voluntarily put out there about yourself, what other people put out there about you, what you can take down and what you can't. And obviously what you can take down, we help you take it down and tell you how to do it. But for the part that you can't take down, I do think just knowing that it's out there from a resilience perspective is very helpful, so that when all of a sudden trolls are attacking your parents about their profession, you don't immediately freak out and think, I was hacked. You remember that the New York Times wedding announcement from your first marriage is still out there that lists, everything that your parents did in your hometown. So information can be empowering, knowing how online harassment works, that it normally, although not always, only lasts around 72 hours, that it normally, although not always, never enters the real world. We like to tell people trolls are trying to get into your head, not into your house, except when they do, unfortunately.
Right.
So.
Okay, great. Let's turn to questions now. Do we have any questions from our audience? We have a question from Gary.
It's good evening, everyone. It's not really a question, it's a comment, a bit ironic one, because we've done media protection training with the Dart Center, and it was always about Haiti, because we wanted to protect our team in Haiti from physical and online harassment. And so when I found ourselves doing training for the U.S. team, the irony just stuck with me to this day. And we left Haiti, fleeing dictatorship, came here thinking that, this is different, this country, we can do the job. I wanted to be a journalist since I was a kid in high school. And so to not be able to be intimidated doesn't work for me. It just doesn't work. I don't back down on against anybody. Just little guys. That this is. It's been tough processing what's going on right now for me. I mean, I don't think I have any mental health issues from it. Partly because, frankly, I wasn't directly. I'm not McAvey. And I didn't experience it firsthand, but as the publisher and founder of this news organization, the irony is just with me that we have to protect ourselves to do journalism in the United States.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, please.
I really appreciate you saying that. And, there's a couple of thoughts I have. I mean, the first thought I have is that I think the way we think about keeping journalists safe needs to keep up with the reality. And I think we got to a point not that long ago, actually, where newsrooms understood that if they send someone into a quote-unquote hostile environment, like a war zone, like a place with an extraordinary amount of civil unrest, that they had to prepare the folks that they were sending and come up with systems. But nowadays, everyone's computer and phone is a hostile environment, and actually your local community might be a hostile environment, and as the rhetoric against the press in this country escalates, there are going to be more and more hostile environments. And so, I mean, my first thought is sort of that, in a way, like we really need to train all journalists that are going out to do this work from J-School onwards to understand ways that they can keep themselves safe, what they can expect or ask of their institutions, what they can ask of civil society, et cetera. The other thought I had is that what's interesting is that the kind of playbook of these attacks, like I think we still somehow, for some reason, I don't mean we in this room, but we collectively as an industry, the journalism industry, think of online harassment as somehow like a distinct thing, right? But it's actually part of an entire spectrum of attacks that are often deployed all together to try to intimidate reporters and intimidate outlets. That could include bogus legal, lawsuits and legal activity. It can include, people showing up and wandering outside your house or outside your newsroom. It can include a lot of different tactics that we are used to seeing in anti-democratic or authoritarian regimes, but that are actually happening all over the place. They're happening in democracies, quote unquote. They're happening everywhere. And I think that it's really important that we sort of understand that this playbook, this set of tactics is proliferating and increasing, and it's not an accident, right? It's made to feel individual and personal, like it's about you, but it's actually not, right? It's about the press, and it's about whether or not there are forces that want a free and independent press in this country or in other countries, and the answer is there are forces who don't want that. And they have figured out that jailing a journalist or beating a journalist up can have a lot of consequences from the standpoint of censure. You could even go to jail. But making a journalist absolutely petrified to be in their own home, there's a lot of plausible deniability in that. It's like, I didn't do it. Somebody else did it. I don't know who. It's all anonymous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, just two reactions to that before we get the next question is first, and also to Gary's comment that, especially in the information sphere, the notion that there are tactics and strategies that don't apply in one reality but apply, I mean, it's all sort of permeates and percolates throughout the information system, which are by its nature transnational. So that's one observation. And the second, just responding, Viktorya, to your comment about bringing a kind of awareness about the safety environment to journalism schools. That's absolutely my mission here and something I'm very committed to. And I'm really happy that Jamila Bukai is with us as well, and she's the Newmark School safety advisor and has been working with our students and with our community here and bringing this kind of awareness into the classroom and into the school itself. So, sure, please, Macaulay. Yeah.
To piggyback of what Victoria is saying, so when I called around the other folks who were on that panel with us in Springfield, I found that another woman had been swatted.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a
that weekend, right? And someone, a third person had been followed home by this like mysterious truck that was hanging around the property that day. So it's beyond just intimidation of the press or suppression of the press. This is bigger, like you said, but it's beyond just our own industry, activists, advocates, people who are just standing up for their communities, also subjected to this type of thing. And this is where like the democratic, like the fabric of democracy becomes really concerning from people like, us coming from Haiti who've seen these tactics used before by strongmen.
Yeah.
I was just going to add to that. It's been widely reported that there was a huge increase in swatting attacks against people associated with the Trump trials earlier this year, judges, witnesses, anyone sort of involved with that case. So reaches beyond journalism, but this sort of intimidation tactics sort of dig into.
I mean, does that make you in any? I'm sorry, we have another question. Let's get to the question. I'll reserve mine right here. Oh, wait.
Go on, Scott.
If you have
It's actually related to something that Sara just said. I work, in my work, I help newsrooms cover the election. So I have an opportunity to talk to lots of people. I was talking to a researcher who studies political violence. And I asked him, what should we expect after the election this year? And he said, well, it's really hard to predict the future, but one way that you can do it is by kind of examining the present. Like, what is happening now? What seems to be happening more now? What is sort of starting to crescendo that might be sort of red flags for what's to come? And he used this as example. He said, well, January 6th, no one predicted, but we could have because of Charlottesville and because of mask protests. And looking back, January 6th was sort of heralded by those things. And so something that, Sara, what you just said is really interesting to me. And sort of the question I have for the panel is, are we seeing something sort of truly new? Are we seeing an increase in tactics? Are we seeing something that might predict what is to come after November 5th?
Panelists.
I'm not asking us to predict the future, but are you seeing something fundamentally different?
Fundamentally different?
Or more? Are we seeing, what happened to Haitian Times?
Is there a shift in the kind of landscape here that's
what was happening to Haitian Times was happening to other news organizations as well. We are definitely seeing, at least, and I don't know if it's just because I don't observe these things as much as you guys do. It seemed like a lot, seems like a lot to me, but maybe it's normal.
I mean, I don't want to. Yeah, you
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was going to say, Joel, I feel like you can reflect on CPJ and the U.S. work and everything.
I think I have to defer to you because this is the thing about online harassment. I think Victoria made this point very well. It wouldn't necessarily be on my radar in the same way at CPJ because it's intended to sort of be below the threshold of a clear press freedom violation. So I don't necessarily. I mean, I'm certainly aware that, but it's very anecdotal, and I think you're much closer to the issue. So I mean, in some ways, Sara, you might have a baseline because you're in a specific newsroom. Do you feel, you're seeing more incidents like this, or is there more concern? Or is it this sort of a kind of ongoing, perennial, challenge that you've been grappling with as an organization for some time? How do you perceive this in terms of your own role?
I've been at the company 2.5 years. I don't want to sort of speak for the institution
Right.
As a whole. I mean, I think all I can say is, leadership is taking it very seriously, and they wouldn't if they hadn't noticed some sort of uptick, So I think
That's fair. And Victoria,
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say that the answer, in my opinion, is yes, but yes, it's longer than the last 6 months or the last 8 months. I think what I've seen in the 7 years now that I've been doing this work is exponentially growing hostility against the media in this country that is extremely and increasingly open and public, right? And like a political tactic and strategy, right? Like murder the media, right? Being scrawled on January 6th on stuff. I mean, I think it's not that none of these impulses were there, but they were understood to be something that you would get in trouble if you were seen to be saying out loud, at least theoretically, not across the country in every pocket, but it was sort of not considered a political strategy to encourage violence against the press in the way that it is now. And I think we're seeing the repercussions of that. And that is what worries me. I mean, it's a little bit of a narrow answer than what you're asking me, but I am concerned about political violence. I'm concerned about stochastic terrorism, which we haven't talked about, but this sense of you kind of create enough discrediting around someone, enough dehumanization around someone, and then something happens, and then you can be like, well, we would never want anything to happen to that reporter. I mean, there was a reporter who was killed in this country in the last 2 years, right? Explicitly because of his reporting. So that's the stuff that worries me, is this kind of escalation, which seems very, very clear and has been documented.
I would add that while I definitely worry about an uptick in political violence, especially what we might see in coming weeks and leading up to an inauguration. I also find it challenging to read the tea leaves, so to speak, regarding how this affects the numbers regarding online harassment. Whether it has to do with two things, whether it is because we are more siloed as a social media space, so it's hard, at least from like a threat intelligence perspective, harder to get one's hand around or head around, so to speak. Changes to how X functions, which used to be known as the kind of unifying public sphere as far as social media is concerned, and was much easier to algorithmically study, from changes within Facebook guarding the type of data that they used to more readily share with researchers so they could predict broader trends, to the fact that we actually do have to contend with alternative platforms such as Blue Sky on one hand, or Mastodon on the other, and on yet a third hand, platforms like Truth Social and Gab. So there's this fragmentation that leads to a much blurrier picture of what this looks like if you were going to study it from an algorithmic perspective, which, if you contrast that with the work done by the US Press Freedom Tracker, where there are very, very clear lines about the march towards political violence as viewed through the lens of people who have such hatred for the press, that's a lot clearer to picture. Another thing that I also hope is not happening that might muddy how we look at this picture has to do with people being inured to it. Other than instances where people SWAT your house and threaten your children, the ability to let the mundane and still stinging instances of online harassment has, in a lot of cases, just become background noise to people who have, thought that they needed to grow a thicker skin in preparation for reporting on this election.
Okay, I think we have Darlie and we have a bunch of questions. Why don't we just pass the mic around, take all the questions that are on the floor now. We'll do one last round of answers, and then we'll break for cookies. So, Darlie.
I selected these cookies for you. Please eat them.
Personal selection by Harlo.
I don't know if it's the same question as the previous gentleman asked. I wonder if you see more escalation based on data during a period of particular event, that you see more escalation of those online harassment.
So let's get all the questions now. So we have Gary, we have a question over here, and
Jamila had one.
And Jamila, and then so 4 questions, and then we'll answer them, and then.
Or did you have a comment, Gary?
It's a comment.
It's a comment. So let's keep Darlene's question in our mind, but let's pass the mic and get everyone to participate. Go ahead, please.
So
Go
we're
ahead.
not going to hear from Gary?
No, we are. Gary, please.
Okay,
give your comment.
I was just going to yield to the questioners. But I think to Scott's question, what I fear, I see what's happening, is the demonization of immigrants. And that's the thread line, the through line I'm seeing now. I mean, what he said, it started in 2015 with the Mexicans comment.
Yeah.
And then it's just been escalating. And I think right now we might likely hear about illegals voting and that whole thing, and people attacking immigrants and journalists, of course, because we are the enemy of the people.
Right. Okay. Question, comment over here, and then Jamila, and then we'll answer.
My question is, it seems to me that there's a whole bunch of admirable things said, and it seemed to me that almost all of them are defensive. That is, how do you prevent this? How do you do that? How do you survive psychologically, and so forth? But I'm wondering, except in a few instances, for example, the guy who attacked the speaker's husband, people who do things physically get arrested for that, but people who are one step back from that, and maybe even advocating others do that, seem to get away scot-free. And what I'm wondering is, as journalists, isn't there the possibility of investigating where this stuff comes from and pointing the finger back at the person who's done it? For example, you've been swatted. Someone called the police and told them a bunch of lies. That's a crime. You push the police to investigate that, or investigate that as a journalist, and pull these people out. And hopefully the result of that, if it was successful, is that there would be an example. You do this stuff, and you could get yourself in trouble, and turn the tables if that's at all possible.
Great.
That's my
I love that question, and I can't wait to get back to it.
Let's hear from Jamila, and then we'll.
Oh, that was such a fun question.
Yeah.
Mine is not as fun. But so focusing on the specific tactics of swatting and of doxing, the swatting one seems to rely on, or at least take advantage of, a very weaponized police force that we have in this country. And doxing, at least of home addresses and phone numbers, seems to also often use the fact that we have very lax privacy regulations in this country when it comes to data brokers or those third-party vendors. So I'm wondering, from all of you who work across with reporters from a lot of different geographies beyond the US, do you see the same amount of doxing and of swatting in other geographies, or is this a really US-specific US-specific tactics?
So let's do this. Let's start with Viktorya. We'll work our way back this way, and we'll let McElvey have the last word, and I'll let you respond to whatever question sort of piqued your interest. So we'll start with Viktorya, and we'll move this way, and we'll end with McElvey.
Harlo, I'm sorry, I also really wanted to answer that question about investigation.
Please.
I'll try to make it quick. I think one of the things that is missing, kind of like big picture in terms of accountability, is that it's very rare to have like detailed forensic investigations of coordinated harassment campaigns. It's partly because they're incredibly time-consuming and resource-intensive, and sometimes you get results and you see all kinds of connections and links, and sometimes you don't. But I think that if we were to have more of them, if we invested in more of those kinds of investigations, it would bear fruit. And I'll give as a very quick example, but a very known, prominent example. In South Africa, there was a family that was basically in bed with a ruling party, right? They are completely intertwined with the ruling party. A bunch of reporters did an investigation of that sort of uncovered all of these ties between this family and the government. The family then hired a fancy schmancy UK PR firm to go after several female reporters who had uncovered this story, including a well-known reporter named Fariel Heffigy at the Daily Maverick, all of which was behind the scenes. So they basically created this insane campaign against this woman. She had to go into hiding. There were death threats. Eventually, there was a detailed investigation, and they uncovered the ties between the family, the government, various political parties and interest groups, this PR firm. All of that came out, and there were enormous repercussions across the board. And it didn't make everything against her stop, unfortunately, but it was significant in terms of its sort of capacity for accountability, but there are very few stories like that. And I know maybe I can count on two hands how many massive investigations into coordinated harassment campaigns that I've seen in the years that I've been doing this work. And it's because they cost a lot of money and take a lot of time.
Okay, Sarah.
Oh, sorry.
No.
I'll just take the international question and let you guys do the other ones. Just based purely on my work with the Times newsroom and the bureaus around the country, around the world, I think, online harassment is pervasive everywhere. But every country has its own local flavor, I would say. And that doesn't mean one is worse than the other, but they're just different. I have not seen, swatting seems to be a uniquely US-based phenomenon. You guys can tell me if you have global data I don't have from outside the Times. That may be because data brokers are such a uniquely US-based phenomenon. I mean, certainly, Europe has the GDPR. There, that kind of information isn't as readily accessible elsewhere. That said, this has also been widely reported. Our Mexico City bureau chief was, doxxed by the president of Mexico. So he didn't share her address, but he read her phone number, in his daily press conference, and that led to her receiving all sorts of horrible harassment as well. So I think it just takes different flavors. But I have not seen swatting anywhere else. I don't know about you.
I would say that in certain places, swatting isn't necessary because perhaps the police are in collaboration with people who want to silence the journalists, and they'll just do it anyways. And that actually does speak to the, if you're to Jamila's question about there being a comparative international, way to evaluate online harassment and its harms. These are typically examples of how it's apples to oranges. Yeah, and so, to talk about what do we do to be offensive about it. Now, I'm not going to get too far into the weeds regarding things like, how to perform your own, roll your own threat intelligence, how to reverse dox yourself to see what's out there on the internet, how to infiltrate, hate groups on the dark web or whatever. These are actually things that people do in places where they don't have any other recourse and only a bunch of time and a computer in front of them. But I do think that right now, and also to harken back to the comparative international analysis, in these cases, which are really, really horrific, when it becomes violent and physical, it's because there are the president himself or herself or whatever usually has no barrier in their way to put your address out there. Law enforcement, there's nothing that stops them. Hiring private investigators on behalf of an oligarch family, they still have the same level of access. In the United States, we're the only country where that's just given away for $1.99 online to anyone. And the reason why that's so that puts us in such a horrible advantage is because it shifts the balance of resources that a bad person has to spend in order to do maximum damage. And that's what's most important. And so until, we can actually get Congress to have meaningful response to the rampant data broker industry, and they lobby so hard to prevent that. But until that change is made, that's the most powerful offense we can take.
So I've been dreaming about, dreaming is a strong word, but I keep visualizing showing up with a bunch of other Haitians to the house of whoever swatted me. I swear, I'm just been this is where I get stuck when I'm thinking about processing emotional. I'm who did this? I have an idea of who it was, right? The police aren't taking it seriously. the prosecutors are like, yeah, we'll send out some subpoenas, but they've got their hands full. So it kind of feels like no one else is going to do this unless, I do it. And so I really want to answer that question for myself. Maybe then I could start processing or have some semblance of peace of mind, because I don't see what else. This might sound really, petty, but I really want to do this and show up and say, why did you do this? Like, I want to know, why. I know why, but I kind of want to fight back that way, if you will. Because the more I think about it, in the middle of all this happening, our team was working on a series about the Parsley Massacre, which was a mass killing, genocide of Haitians that took place in 1937 in the Dominican Republic. And the night that the mass killing started, the president of the Dominican Republic at the time, Rafael Trujillo, drove up in his luxury car to this border city, and he said, I heard that the Haitians were stealing your cattle, stealing your crops, and making off with them, the Haitian immigrants that were working and living there. And so we're making an example out of them in this town. We started and meted out justice to those, and we're going to continue that justice. So for a whole week, they literally went around, his goons went around and slaughtered Haitians indiscriminately. And the toll that we know of is 20,000. It might be 34,000 is the highest number, okay? So as we're editing these stories, this is happening to us in Springfield. I couldn't help but to see the parallels. You have a strongman, authoritarian type who goes in, he takes a lie, he knows it's a lie, people tell him, no, that didn't happen, but he runs with it anyway, and then he finds people who do his bidding, and he deputizes them to go around literally hacking Haitians and throwing babies up in the air to catch them with their bayonets. So when Donald Trump and J.D. Vance say things like, we're gonna do mass deportation, they're eating the pets and stuff, this all goes into the dehumanization piece that we touched on just a little bit to justify what happens next. So for me, the swatting is one thing, but I'm even more scared about what happens if this person is allowed to be back in the White House. We're talking about, have we seen an increase in the number of doxing incidences? I'm sure there has been, because I'm an example of it, right? And it's because these people are emboldened. They feel like they can get away with whatever they want after Charlottesville. And the Supreme Court just went ahead and said, yeah, you're fine, presidential immunity. So this is where my head is as a journalist, thinking about what the bigger story is here. It's not just about us, just about the press. It's about something that could potentially escalate even further to create an America that we won't even recognize in 2 years, much less 5 years from now.
Good for closing out on that, Joel.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to let that be the final word, because how can I possibly contribute beyond what McElvey's already said? But I just want to, remind everyone, this is the third in our series on covering elections. We looked first at, the challenges that journalists face about protecting their sources. We spoke second on a panel on the kind of challenges of covering protests and engaging with police and the evolution of the law. And now we spent some time looking at the kind of online environment. So clearly, this is an extraordinarily difficult moment. I think McElvey has made clear what the stakes are and what the contribution of journalists are, and that's something we can sort of celebrate and sort of hopefully will provide a bit of an uplifting and to think about the kind of responsibility and role that we play in the coming weeks in covering these events despite the challenges. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank FPF. I want to thank Harlo for picking the cookies. I want to thank the Center for Community Media, and I want to thank the Kettering Foundation for underwriting tonight's program. So with that, thank you all for coming. Reception's right outside, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much.